Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. It's so great to be back with you on the HFE Hub, and today I'm chatting with Vanessa Huron about drones. So how did you become interested in human factors and ergonomics?
It's a funny thing. I've been working in the educational design and delivery space for a long time, and I, at one stage, started collaborating with Associate Professor Carly Kapanecki, as I'm sure many of your listeners would know. And we started working on a workplace safety course, and for me, it just kind of clicked. I realised what I was doing every day was human factors. I just wasn't calling it that. The concept of universal design for learning, of thinking about the different people interacting in spaces, whether online or even in a classroom. And I was just absolutely hooked and fascinated. And I realised that there was a true opportunity for me to be able to use my background in educational design to then transfer that into workplace competency and industry-based teaching programs and initiatives. And so that's where I ended up today. And so that then also transferred into the drone space, where I was thinking about how we could really impart teaching and human factors concepts and principles to make sure that students and people in industry were given the correct space to train and to understand how to safely operate drones and to have proper impact in society. Okay, so I realise that you're working in an area of aviation. What directly led you into drones? So I won't spend too long on the Bachelor of Aviation drones program that we have. At the moment, it's technically called Remotely Piloted Aircraft Systems. But that actually really started to spark my interest in the space. We were given an opportunity to be able to train and get our remote pilot license, which was a really great perk to work in UNSW aviation. I obviously jumped at the chance. So I was able to get my license in drone flying up to 25 kilo, multi-rotor. There's different types of flying, there's different weight classes.
So maybe tell us about a little bit more about drones. I mean, really, they're just the buzzy things that are flying over our heads, and we're at the beach sometimes and in other places. So let's maybe talk about the differences between these.
Yeah, sure. So you're right. A lot of people have a perception that there are these noisy beasts. You know, is it a sound of bees or is it a drone? All these ideas of what they are and security and safety. And it's quite interesting, because I think that sometimes there's a perception that they're going to just take over the world and they're just going to suddenly be in the skies and we don't have any control over this. It's actually completely not like that at all. And it's interesting when you start to fly how you see so much alignment with other vehicles and other aircraft in the ways that we have to think about human factors and safety in those spaces. So there's two different types of conversation here, and one's recreational and one's commercial. With recreational, it's an interesting thing. A lot of drones were released onto the market for people to buy, and there was an identification from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. That's the Australian Safety Authority. For people listening overseas, there's different versions of those authorities. And there was a recognition that we had to consider the space. We had to consider the humans. We had to consider that we needed to have a controlled space. We needed to have guidelines for people to be able to fly these drones, even if they didn't need to have a license. And a lot of people don't realise that. So for CASA, they actually released a Know Your Drone guidelines. And so those guidelines go through things like making sure that you have a safe distance between other people, making sure that you're not flying next to another aircraft, you're thinking about shared airspace, making sure that you're not flying in populous areas, so you're not flying over people in beaches and parks, and all of those different things. There's weight classes even there, even if you don't have a license. So there's weight classes under 250 grams and under 2 kilo, and there's different spaces that you're allowed to fly. There's no fly zones, obviously. There's areas such as airports where you can't fly. You have to think about areas where helicopters go, and you have to think about hospitals, and there's lots of different things there. And a lot of people don't realise that there are guidelines for people to fly, and that's just recreational alone. But when you're starting to think about the commercial space, so anything over 2 kilos or anything that you're wanting to conduct with business, you actually need to have a remote pilot license. And so you can have different weight categories, so up to 7 kilos, up to 25 kilos, up to 150 kilos, and even over that. And each of those needs a different type of license and a different type of qualification. You also have beyond visual line of sight and also visual line of sight. So they need to have different training, because standard license would have a visual line of sight, not a beyond visual line of sight, because there's different levels of safety and training that's associated, which is really interesting. But what I found super interesting when I started to train myself was that so many things that I had learnt in other areas actually applied to a drone. Because a lot of people think about, oh, it's just a thing, I don't know, you buy from Kmart or whatever. But it actually isn't. If you buy a real drone, you've got stabilizers, you have a gyroscope, you have, processing units. They're actually these amazing things, and they come in different sizes, and they are very stable. But at the end of the day, they're a vehicle. And so you have to consider things like, how do you consider shared airspace, for example? You have planes in the sky, you have helicopters in the sky, so you need to be able to understand that. You think about fatigue. You're repeating a task, and you are operating that for a period of time. So you have to have rest breaks, just like when you're driving a car or any other vehicle. You have to think about, repetitive strain. You have to think about your surroundings. So interestingly, when you are going to perform a commercial task, you should do it with any task, but particularly when you're doing commercial, you actually need to have a job safety assessment. And so it's really interesting when we were training in the space, we had to work as a team to assess our surroundings. The chief remote pilot had already signed off and created an assessment, but you still do a check on the day. So they're adding in those layers of safety to make sure that they're already considering in advance, what are the things I need to think about space, the equipment, the processes, the people. And then we do an assessment on the day, because obviously in a live setting, things can change. So you're always thinking about safety and human factors, and you're thinking about what could happen. You're thinking about, okay, I'm training in a park. What do we do as a team if we see someone run across the park with a ball or a dog? Okay, immediate landing, if safe to land. Call out, signal to each other. You have to signal handovers if you're handing over the controller to make sure that there's a recognition of shift of responsibility. You have to think about the surroundings of the park or the area. Certain drones allow you to do geofencing. So you have a particular distance you can go before the drone knows to signal that it can't go any further. And that's to obviously enforce some of those rules around distance. So there's a lot of things to think about, even thinking about, you can't fly under the influence or over certain, blood alcohol readings, and you can't obviously be under the influence of drugs, just like flying any other vehicle. It's so fascinating, and there's so many things I can tell everyone about them, but I think the take-home message here is there's actually a lot that we think about when it comes to human factors and safety that you don't see when you're looking at a drone flying over the water. And you think, oh, there's another drone. Okay, I guess it's surveying a beach or something. Well, yeah, but it's actually probably gone through, all the checks and balances around having a REOC, which is a remotely piloted aircraft operator certificate, and making sure that there's considerations even of if we're surveying, what are we allowed to capture? What are we allowed to store? We can't store people that haven't been approved. That's not allowed. That needs to not be stored, and it needs to be deleted even if it's accidentally captured. There's so many things in place that people don't realise, and it's understandable because it's new.
Given that it's new, let's step back just slightly and ask the question, where are they being used? I'm blown away, really, and pardon the pun, at how unique this is, and I'm kind of wondering how this is, monitored in the recreational space as well as the commercial space. But maybe let's talk commercially for a second. Where are they actually being used?
Okay, they're actually being used in so many different spaces, and I'll get to the breadth of it pretty shortly, but there's going to be some things that people have seen in the news. Maybe recently they would have seen things around how they're used at beaches. So a good example, something I was fascinated about. I remember when I first came into my job, first week out, and I got to go and see our third-party provider, our assistance, so Surf Life Saving New South Wales UAV, Australian UAV service. So I went to their central headquarters, and they have all of these screens that patrol all the beaches across New South Wales, and they flick to different beaches. And what they actually do is they monitor the beaches to make sure that people are safe. So what they do is they look and they say, okay, well, I can identify there that there's a fisherman. He's not wearing a life jacket on the rocks. So they're already doing an assessment, which is really cool. And so they're saying, okay, let's make sure that he's safe and he's okay. Let's keep an eye. But when they see that there's an incident that happens, someone might be floating offshore, they might be stuck in a rip, something like that, they do an assessment to determine what to do next and how to resource that particular situation. So they might say things like, okay, is this beach manned? Is there a nearby beach in terms of someone being able to come across to assist in this particular situation? How far are they? What's the severity of the situation? What can we do? And more importantly, can we potentially optimise this using other vehicles at our disposal? So an example of that might be with a drone. There might be someone who is at risk of drowning. They might be struggling to swim. So a drone can get out there really fast. And what it can do is it can drop a flotation device. And it can then assist the person to stay afloat while they can actually dispatch more help, a jet boat or something to that effect to be able to save the person. So that's a great example of how we can consider a situation for efficiency, but also safety, because we're not sending out, for example, if it's a windy day or there's particular conditions, can we make an assessment where we recognise it might actually be better to send out a drone than send out a human? And from a resourcing and also from an environmentally friendly perspective, it's probably more efficient to send out the drone to mitigate the risk or to manage the risk before we can do something else to fix it. That's just one example. There are other examples where we use larger drones for agriculture. We use drones in mining and construction, potentially if we're trying to survey an area that might be unsafe or unknown for a human to go. Because we have air vehicles, but we also have land vehicles. And so it's considering, okay, is it better for us to actually send a drone in to use sensors to assess the potential risk or, whether it's safe enough for someone to enter that space? It's much safer to put the drone in there. There might be some other areas that people have recognised from the news. So, for example, during the pandemic, there was a company called Wing that's up in Queensland. They now work with DoorDash, but at the time they were working on particular grocery and medical drops. So for people in remote communities or people who had access issues, they were able to receive groceries and medical supplies to assist them using a drone. And the great thing about that is the drone itself is quite efficient in terms of its manufacturing, and it's also what it takes to fuel it to transport to locations, much more than sending out vehicles and having people going through traffic or potentially spreading infection. So those are only some examples. But the really cool thing about drones is that a lot of people see them as, okay, they're about flying. Yeah, they are, sure. But what they actually are is they're a conduit. They're a conduit to addressing challenges and thinking about ways to make things more safe and more efficient. And so when you think about it that way, the areas that they can be used in are so much broader. And in many cases, they're areas that we might not have even thought of yet. Because when you start to think about, okay, it might be an existing process, how can I make it safer and more efficient? Then suddenly this isn't about just flying something over a beach or, it's taking photos of my wedding. No, it's something that actually can really help and impact society.
That's amazing. I'm going to ask probably the dumbest question in the world, but I was thinking, if I'm drowning out in the ocean and clearly I'm somewhere where nobody else seems to be, I'm feeling alone and frightened. Now, if this device comes flying through the air with a flotation device, that is awesome. But I'm going to laugh myself. I'll ask this question: can you communicate?
I'm sure that they would have the possibility to. I don't think the ones that are floating to you would. Having said that, though, they are very high and they're actually quite small. I think people are thinking that they're going to be these menacing, UFO style things that kind of float over you, but they're not. They're actually quite small, and they can be quite high. So because obviously you have to think about safety too. And not have them right next to people,
That's okay. I'm asking the questions that the people who are listening
It is a fair question. It's something that I'm sure can be developed. But I think the bigger thing here is that there needs to be more awareness, right? When we have a car or a bus, yes, okay, sure. We still kind of might be alarmed by the sound, but we recognise the sound, or we recognise its presence because we're used to it. And I think that's the important thing is it's less about having these, okay, we need to have measures to say, okay, I need to speak to you via my drone, and instead think about, okay, how can we have a conversation? How can we help people to understand what they can do, what they don't do? I think the problem is that in many cases, people have seen a lot of the different aspects or particular scenarios around using drones that might be less favourable. And there's actually a lot of benefit to them, but there's also, as I mentioned before, a lot of regulation and a lot of consideration that goes into thinking about that airspace. And so when people are able to understand it, like we're having a conversation today, you start to realise, okay, it's like having a plane in the sky. It's like having a car on the ground. It's, it's just another vehicle. It's just that it's new. And I think that will come with time and with discussion and with making the public or helping the public to understand what they can do, and that they are something to support and help society, not to be feared.
I love the statement that you've made that it's a conduit for safety, because if it's able to go into areas where people can't go, it opens up a whole new world, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that when you start to think about it that way, you realise what the purpose of them is in the space, that they're not meant to be a menace to society. That they actually can be really, really useful things. And perhaps that's because it's come from the concept of people thinking that drones are just toys. They're not. Real drones are not toys. I can definitely verify that after the amount of theory and practical that I had to go through to get my license. They are not toys. And you actually have to learn a lot of human factors in air law, meteorology, navigation, all of the things, those concepts around what a crewed pilot would have to learn. You have to learn that in a different sense, of course, in a different context. But you still have to understand the airspace, and you have to understand all of the mechanics to be able to fly. Of course, that's for commercial, but there's a lot that goes into considering that space. And you also have to pass a pretty... you have to go through an exam. You have to go through to show that you are certified to do what you do.
So you mentioned that there's licensing, and clearly you've also mentioned that these vehicles are different sizes and different weights, and so therefore there's different levels of licensing. So just talk about that. Do you have to start at the base level, just something that's as big as a mosquito to start with, and then eventually we go from there, or can you go straight for the big guns?
So usually you have to start on a smaller drone, even when you're training. So even though I was training up to 25, I started on a much smaller drone for my flight training, and then we moved upward into say 15 kilo for assessment. It's like anything, they're not going when you're learning how to drive a car. They don't just kind of say, "Here's the car." You're not practicing, you're not with instruction, you're not, you have, for example, in a car, you have different speed limits, and you have, different requirements, and you can't have passengers at the beginning and all those types of things. With drones, obviously, it's not align in the same way because you don't have a passenger and it's not about speed as such. So instead, you do start on practicing with a smaller drone and then you will increase. And you do have to kind of have those base licenses to then add on, and you add on weight class, and you can add on beyond visual line of sight. So all of those things are in addition to the base remote pilot license, because you need to actually understand how to fly something, and it's also managing risk, right? You don't want to have someone suddenly take on a 150 kilo drone for many reasons. Also, you don't want to completely destroy that. But it is really interesting to see the movement and the way that you fly the drone is similar, but you can feel the difference because of the weight of the drone in terms of how it's actually almost smoother because it is, you know, taking into account the weight distribution of the drone, which is, yeah, it's quite interesting to feel the differences there.
Do you know, I hadn't really thought about this till now, the fact that, and you've mentioned it, that you're flying an aircraft. And where do you start to learn to do this? Obviously, you're learning with someone who's a trained pilot. Are you in an airfield? Where are you doing this?
So you have different places. For me, we were out in an open, empty, completely allocated for the day sports field. You need to have something which is a wide enough space to make sure that you aren't having any collisions and you have enough space to fly. Some people do fly indoor if it's kind of recreational, but for us it was a larger field. As I mentioned, it had geofencing, and we had essentially allocated kind of boxed areas that had, you know, a measured space to make sure there was enough clearance and there was enough space between each of the trainees who were flying their aircraft, so that there wasn't a risk of collision or any overlap in that space. Yeah, it's quite interesting, and they obviously have to assess the space to make sure that it's adequate to start with, and they have to make sure that, you know, there's not going to be suddenly a situation where you have a whole lot of school children or sporting teams that are going to come onto the oval. It has to be completely cleared out, and they have to make sure that there's no identified hazards and other things in terms of, you know, thinking about trips and particular areas that could be an issue for flying, because you are flying in the air, but the person's still on the ground. So obviously when you're staring at an aircraft and you're needing to make sure that you focus, of course you do check and that there's no obstacles and no issues before you use the space, but you still want to mitigate that risk by making sure to choose a space that's adequate in the first place. Yeah, and they will obviously do an assessment too. So there's particular apps. I won't name them, but there's various apps there that will show you, depending on your class, depending on whether you have a license or you don't, or different weight classes and rules, they'll show you whether you can or can't fly in an area, or if there's particular times of the day. There's also things like proceed with caution, because there's an identified helipad nearby, so you need to be on the lookout in case there's potentially a medical, like a helicopter that comes past, to make sure that you can land, so that you don't have any interference there.
Are these vehicles registered before you leave the ground? Like, do people know that they're in the air? Yeah. So commercial vehicles, you have to register. Absolutely. And it's interesting because if something happens to the vehicle too, you do have to notify authorities, even if it's just flown away. So that sounds like a strange thing. It sounds like a kite, right? And it doesn't happen frequently, but in the case of, you know, if a drone flies away or there might be an incident, you actually do have to log and report that, because it's a vehicle. And when you think about it that way, you're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's not a toy, it's a vehicle. I do have to do that if I had a vehicle too. Yeah. That's right. And you've actually said, you know, out of line of sight. So, I mean, you can't see this. So I suppose the question is, if the thing's flown away and you've talked about geofencing, and I'm assuming that at some point you lose comms, don't you? And then you don't know what's happened to it.
Well, it depends on the scenario. It's a little bit complicated, but there's different levels, but you are actually trained. So when you're flying the drone, you are trained to know what to do in an event where you feel like you might lose control, or there might be, a sudden change in wind or conditions. So there are things like return to home features and other things that you are actually trained to do. So we aren't just trained to, left and right, front and back. It's not just that. It's also you have to execute procedures where, the drone is flown up in the air and you need to make sure in front of an instructor that you can safely land it, or you can do a safe emergency handover. There's all of those procedures that you work through before you're certified, because they understand that things can happen. So it's all about managing that risk.
You mentioned JSAs, job safety analyses.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk through those. Is it just a battery list of things given to you, or are they teaching you how to develop the JSA, how to understand the environment you're flying in?
Yeah. So with the job safety assessment, they do actually take you through how to create one of those. So to start with, they show you how they've created one for your training day, and then they take you through the process of then reinforcing and checking that they still apply on the day, because the chief remote pilot has to go through all of that prior to the day. You don't want to do that on the spot and be rushed, because it won't be a sound JSA. And then as you go through your own training, you have to show how you would conduct and develop that kind of an assessment yourself, and that needs to be verified with an instructor. They don't just let you go rogue. They need to make sure that you have an understanding of your space and what you would do, and that you have the level of detail that is necessary for someone to be able to verify and check that, because you have the chief remote pilot, but then you also have a person who checks. So you've got a second to make sure, because, relying on one person, as we know, in safety isn't necessarily the best practice. So you do have several points of contact to make sure that happens. But of course, you get trained in how to create one of those. And that's important to think about, because not everybody has had to create an assessment, a risk assessment, right? It's not something that everyone does. We take it for granted here, but not everyone has done it before. So they take that in mind when they are training people. And it's cool. I mean, when I was training in my theory, we also had some firefighters who were doing the license too, because obviously drones can also be used for firefighting, thinking about fire retardants and firefighting measures. That's really interesting too. And then I know some people who also had ambulance workers who were doing the training separately. So if you think about that, there's a diversity of people who can use drones for their operations. It's quite interesting, and we haven't even gotten into the concepts of using it for music and industry and entertainment and all of those other things too.
Well, maybe we could go there. But before we do, my question is, you mentioned two people, and I understand in the training aspect of things, there's two people. Ultimately, in the field, is there a requirement to always have two people for commercial drones?
It does depend. You usually will have a second, and then you do have your identified chief remote pilot for a particular job.
Also mentioned two interesting things, and so let's maybe just buzz in there for a second. Another pun. Used in fire, this makes perfect sense to me, to be able to get somewhere that we don't want to send people, but I'm also conscious of the fact you've got a little aircraft thing that I imagine is flammable at some point. So how close to fire can these things get? You might not know the answer to that, but can it go into a burning building, or can't it?
I don't think that you would have every drone go into one of those buildings. I would assume that there are going to be designed drones to do that would have the appropriate materials to do that.
Yeah. I know you're not working in fire. It's just
I'm not working in fire. But having said that, though, it comes back to that idea of if you are going to have a scenario where someone is going to have a commercial operations to do that, they would need to get sign off in the first place, and it would need to be identified that it was adequate in terms of the material and what you were doing for the job that you were going to undertake, to make sure that everything was sound before you then completed that for safety reasons, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think that you would just be kind of sending in just anything. And obviously some people customize customized drones too. So just like the wing drone I was telling you about earlier, that is used for DoorDash, it's designed in such a way that it's lightweight and it's for the operations that need to be conducted.
Okay, and you've mentioned music and entertainment. So apart from photography of these great events, how are they using it in that space?
Yeah, I mean, photography definitely. It has been used for light shows too. But a lot of it is also looking at aerial surveying and photography in that space mainly. But it is becoming more predominant to be used there. There's obviously all the little fun elements of using drones in entertainment too, which might be for another podcast, but we're talking about the serious stuff today.
Okay, the serious stuff. Okay, they're using it in agriculture, aren't they? So they're using drones to even move cattle. I don't know if you've been across that space, but I remember seeing something on a program.
But this is the thing, right? I mean, if it sits within the payload and it's safe and there's the stabilizers, it can be done. And it's not that surprising with cattle because there's also, designs around drones that are for patient transport.
Tell us about that.
So there's particular drones, obviously they'd be quite large and they have to be able to have a particular payload because payload needs to be considered. It's the attached load to the drone itself that needs to actually be considered in the weight. You don't just suddenly, go, oh, okay, I've got this weight of drone and I can just put whatever I want on it. It doesn't work that way. And so there are larger vehicles that can essentially be used to transport a patient to a nearby hospital or medical facility. And so that then allows for particular remote areas or areas that are harder to access to be able to bring patients to medical aid, which is really interesting.
That's really fascinating when you think about it. Clearly, we've got someone on the ground at some point because you've got to attach the patient, but realistically, instead of having to transport them from one aircraft to another, you've already got them on an aircraft and they can. So how far, and you probably don't know the answer to this, but I guess I'm wondering how far they can fly. Let's go, if it's with a patient, are we thinking just 1 to 2 kilometres? Are we thinking a bit longer than that? You might not know.
I'm not actually sure how far they would fly. And I think that would be something that one of our drone leads, so Dr. Graham Doig, would be probably a great person to talk about this on another segment.
Let's do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not sure about distance, and it's a tricky question because I feel like because the drone space isn't absolute, it's going to continue as they're developed more and more. The distances will become larger, and the payload will become greater, and all the things in the capacity of what the drones can do will change for the better. So I don't know the specific answer in terms of distance, but I know that in that space that is happening, which is very interesting.
This is a really fast developing area, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly when people are starting to realise how much can be done in the space. Another example that's quite fascinating is its use in being able to dispatch defibrillators and EpiPens and medical equipment that when you think about it, for example, you might have defibrillators around a city, but they might be in particular contact points that are harder to access, where if it's something where it can be identified and signalled that there needs to be one sent across for medical aid, that can happen really fast. You don't have the roads and the traffic and all of the things to get through or need to find the location. And that's when you think about the capabilities there, it's actually going to be really exciting to see what we can do.
That is really exciting. I'm just thinking dropping an EpiPen, to someone out in the middle of somewhere with an anaphylactic response. That's life-saving, as is the defibrillator, but it's small and so accessible. I'm fascinated. So I'm surprised you only want to kind of, you're learning yourself. So are you going to develop your license? Are you thinking personally that you might develop that license further, given your interest?
Yeah, I mean, I am ambitious. It's just time, really. But I would absolutely love to. I'm quite envious because our students get to fly much larger drones, so drones up to the agricultural size, and that's because we're not training them just to be drone pilots. We're training them to be drone entrepreneurs. So that's the whole concept of them being in that space. And so my focus at the moment is on really making sure to strengthen that space for drone education and making sure that we are getting pilots out there that are not just thinking about, okay, what is the task that someone has given me that we know today? It's, okay, how can I think about a space and innovate, and how can I really address challenges with what I know and the skills I have and apply that to a business context? It's a much different conversation when you think about it that way, because otherwise it's just doing the same thing day in, day out with them, and that's not the point. We're trying to think about how can they actually benefit life. They're not meant to replace humans in a negative way. They're meant to, in a situation, say, okay, maybe in this particular circumstance, it's better to use a drone than to risk a human. And that human then can actually be working in another part of the process of the organisation in a way that's meaningful and also safe and efficient. And that's a different conversation.
It is. This is about enhancing work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think everyone has a fear that anything that is technology is going to take over. The robots are going to take over and and take over the humans. And that's not meant to be the case. It's meant to be, how can we use them to our advantage? How can we design a system to be better and be enhanced by the use of drones and the integration of drones?
And we need a human to fly them anyway.
I mean, they can, in some cases, be autonomous, but the design of how you use them, even some of the programming, making sure that you are still watching the process and ensuring that everything is still safe and is happening so someone can intervene if necessary. Yes, absolutely, you still need to have a human, even in those circumstances. We're not going to suddenly get phased out because of drones. They're not suddenly going to take over the skies and take over the space and take over humans. I just want to reinforce that.
Now, I bought 2 drones for my nephews for Christmas, and they were just small ones. But you did mention something that interested me, because when I was literally reading the instructions, it had the back to home base button, where call it home. And I thought that was one of the most important things if I'm giving it to 2 10-year-olds for recreational purposes. But anyway, I'm just throwing that in there. Oh,
100%. I have 2 of my own little drones at home, and they're small. They're less than 250 grams. But anyone that's flying my drone, they're still going to get a proper safety briefing and a training session. Not on my watch. It's still happening. So absolutely, they need to go through all of the checks and procedures. We did a home, made sure we do clearance and assessment of our field before we fly, and we check our space. And I mean, that's not a hard thing for people to do in terms of the Know Your Drone is really helpful through CASA. Make sure if you are looking at flying recreational drones that you look that up. It's really helpful. It's designed for recreational use. It's not meant to be overwhelming. It's nothing crazy. It's just helpful for you to know that you're flying safely and with other people in mind and other environmental factors in mind.
So from your experience so far, where do you see drones going, the future for drones? What else do you see?
It's tricky because for me, I kind of look at every single process and can see a use for it. It's, as I said, if you think about safety and efficiency, it can be used in anything, which is really exciting. But for me, I won't get too much into it today, but what I'm actually interested in is the capability of designing drone training and drone use for inclusivity of more people, of more users. So we're actually looking at how could drone flying be improved for accessibility for some people with disability. So that's something that I'm really interested in, because drones in aviation, they're a game changer in that space, because they allow for many people to fly and be part of the aviation industry who might not have been able to through the use of crewed aviation. So that's really fascinating. And that's definitely a watch this space, because that's happening and bubbling away, and we're really excited about it.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.